Hey everybody, Marcus here. One of my subscribers approached me asking if there's any way that philosophy can help in overcoming hatred. I put forward some advice that this subscriber followed and, well, found helpful. However, the advice I gave should be supplemented with further exposition in order to help understand the nature of the problem. This video is intended as an exposition as to the workings of hatred as it has come to be understood within the philosophical schools of antiquity. The goal of this video is to give someone experiencing hatred a deeper understanding of what they are going through. But this video will not itself address mechanisms for overcoming hatred comprehensively anyways. Hatred as a desire is part of the domain of the passions. There are concrete methods on purging oneself of the passions in general, but those methods will demand a short series of videos independent of the subject of this video. As such, I have elected to simply focus on understanding hatred as opposed to mixing the subjects. So, let's get started. Let us turn to the essay by Plutarch entitled On Envy and Hatred to help us out. Hatred, as said earlier, is a passion. We have the subject who experiences hatred, and we also have the object of that hatred. What hatred desires is that the object of hatred cease to exist. Now, hatred is remarkably similar to envy, and oftentimes the subject claiming hatred may actually be experiencing envy. As such, we will need to describe envy in parallel to hatred to ensure that the subject is in fact experiencing hatred and not envy. Now, a prosperous man is the type of man most likely to be the object of both envy and hatred, though this is clearly not always the case. Hatred proceeds from the opinion that the person we hate is evil. If not in general, then they are at least evil to us. The man who hates perceives the object of his hate has wronged him in some way. Envy differs from hatred in that a man who envies another wishes to see the object of his envy ruined, his happiness destroyed, but he does not desire the man he envies to be himself destroyed. These descriptions make sense and can be accounted for in many real-world examples. The rich are, well, often the object of both envy and hatred. Envy would stem from the subject perceiving great happiness in the rich man, and the subject would desire that the rich man lose his fortune, but does not desire that the rich man himself is destroyed. Now, there is a joke that I heard a long time ago that describes envy perfectly. Now, a farmer finds a magic lamp on his land. Upon rubbing the lamp, a genie appears and offers the farmer a single wish. The farmer, thinks for a moment and says, "My neighbor just bought a new cow. I wish that cow drops dead." As we see from the story, the farmer does not desire his neighbor to be destroyed. The farmer desires his neighbor's happiness to be destroyed. And if indeed the neighbor's happiness is destroyed by the cow dropping dead, the envy of the farmer will be satiated, and he will envy no longer. Now, the happiness and success of another is not something that causes you harm. And since the perceived happiness of another is the object of one's envy, one is never justified in envy, and envy itself is never just. Hatred, however, is quite different. Hatred can be just. Now, let us take an example of just hatred. Hatred towards vice, well, is always justified, and a desire to see vice destroyed is praiseworthy. In this way, hatred to evil individuals is also justified, and the desire to see them destroyed would also be justified. Let us go back to the example of the rich man. In what way can he be hated? Well, there are those who look upon the rich and in their envy, which is shameful to the subject of envy, fabricate a perceived slight that the rich man has done to him. Such a man does this because he would rather hate than be envious. And to hate, he must transform the rich man into an evil man. To do this, he can imagine that all those who are rich necessarily acquired their wealth through, some sort of fraud, theft, or other unjust methods. Such a man further rationalizes that the wealth possessed by the rich man would in some way, in some proportion, belong to the subject of envy had only the rich man not stolen it. Such a mental exercise, can in turn transform envy into hatred, but is not a process that will necessarily take place in every case, as the perceived cause of the happiness of the object of envy may be something that cannot be rationalized back into being a slight against the subject of envy. For example, a woman may envy the looks of a female celebrity, but cannot easily transform that envy into a slight against herself and therefore make the female celebrity evil. So, in the case of someone transforming envy into hatred, such hatred is never justified, as no actual wrongdoing took place. Now, hatred grows in a man in proportion to the object of hatred's getting worse. This means that if the subject of hatred perceives ever more acts of evil stemming from the object of hatred, so too the subject of hatred will hate the object more. Envy, on the other hand, grows with the success and happiness of the object of envy. So envy of the rich grows as the rich, get richer. Earlier, we said that hatred can be justified. We said a subject is justified in hating the object if the object indeed is evil. Let us explore the notion of evil then. Evil in philosophy needs to be considered as a privation, an absence of something, as opposed to a presence of something. Evil is not something you have, but is the state of being who is deprived of something. Darkness, for example, is not the presence of something, but the absence of light. Evil works in a similar way. So, what is this thing that an evil person lacks? Well, the good. But what would be good as far as the human condition is concerned? Well, it would be virtue. So, an evil person is someone who lacks all virtues. Virtues such as justice, courage, temperance, prudence, wisdom, and so on. So, the only way to have justified hatred of someone is if that person has no virtues. Okay, but how can we tell if someone has no virtue? Now, to answer this, we need to look to the Platonic dialogue entitled Phaedo. In this dialogue, Socrates describes how a man becomes a misanthrope, namely, how a man becomes hateful of all of humanity. Quote, "But first there is a certain experience we must be careful to avoid, that we must not become misologues as people become misanthropes. There is no greater evil one can suffer than to hate reasonable discourse. Misology and misanthropy arise in the same way. Misanthropy comes when a man without knowledge or skill has placed great trust in someone and believes him to be altogether truthful, sound, and trustworthy. Then, in a short time afterwards, he finds him to be wicked and unreliable. And then, this happens in another case. When one has frequently had that experience, especially with those whom one believed to be one's closest friends, then, in the end, after many blows, one comes to hate all men and to believe that no one is sound in any way at all. This is a shameful state of affairs, and obviously due to an attempt to have human relations without any skill in human affairs." End quote. What Socrates is saying is that a man, due to his own ignorance and naivety, will choose to engage with people who lack virtue. He will do this by blindly placing his trust in their hands. He is then betrayed by these people. When this happens over and over again to a man, he comes to believe that all men are in fact untrustworthy and therefore riddled with vice. So in this way, he comes to see all of humanity as evil and therefore hate all of humanity. Now, the key to this passage is the point that it is the subject of hatred who himself is not virtuous, and out of his ignorance of virtue, he has no way of distinguishing between good people and bad people. In his ignorance, he will put his trust in the wrong people and then suffer betrayal. So, a man can only truly be justified in his hatred if first and foremost he is a man of virtue, as this allows him to see virtue or an absence of virtue in others. In this way, the virtuous man can then correctly distinguish between which actions taken against him are real injuries and which only appear as injuries, and therefore should not be considered as injuries. But this holds true from the other direction too. A man lacking the virtue of justice may still perceive his actions as just, but due to his ignorance of justice, has false beliefs informing him what is just and what is unjust. So, in this way, an unjust man will appear unjust to a just man, while sometimes appearing just and sometimes unjust to an unjust man. Now, though hatred can be justified for some things, it is often difficult to justify it for others. The reason being is that often our own virtue is imperfect. This leaves room for doubt, whether or not indeed something we perceive as a slight is real or imagined. It is generally a good rule of thumb not to entertain hate for, one serious reason. If indeed you are justified in your hatred, then the object of your hate is not only something you desire to cease to exist, but the object of your hatred ought to cease to exist, and you are justified in bringing about such an outcome. Though we can all agree that evil ought to be hated and therefore destroyed, and a man who could do this would not only be justified but praised, we have a hard time with our ability to, identify evil. As history continues to show us, when someone gets the idea they're justified in their hatred, nothing good happens. Now, let us also make a slight distinction on how hatred can manifest itself. In the first case, we have a form of, intellectual hatred. This is a cold desire for the object of hatred to cease to exist. Many of us have this sort of cold hatred for evil. The second manifestation is the hot or emotionally charged manifestation of hatred. This hot hatred actively plays on our emotions, at times tossing us into anger, while at other times into resentment, and yet others into a malicious joy if we can imagine the destruction of the object we hate. This hot hatred is an extension of the cold hatred. It is the emotional manifestation of our intellectually determined conclusion. Now, in order to fully rid oneself of hatred, one of two things needs to happen. In the first case, we must come to realize that we had been mistaken in our judgment about the object of our hate. We must come to the realization that the object of our hate is in fact not evil, and therefore our hatred is unjustified. The second way we can free ourselves of our hate is if the object of our hate is reformed. If the object of our hate is reformed, then so too it can no longer be perceived as evil, and our hatred once again becomes unjustified. If we manifest this hotness in our hatred, it should also subside over time to conform to our intellectual beliefs. To achieve this intellectual cleansing, we need to pursue virtue and resolve our experiences with the object of hatred against a deeper knowledge of virtue. However, sometimes we can intellectually acknowledge that our hatred is not justified, but still be caught in the grip of the emotions, in the grip of this hot hatred. In order to purge those emotions, we need to practice certain exercises. Now, I will only give one example of such an exercise in this video, as I plan a much more comprehensive accounting of them at a later time. Now, let us imagine that we come to hate a specific person. This person has done us what, we perceive as wrong on multiple occasions. From this, we conclude that they are a bad person and therefore evil. Now, for the time being, let us not focus on whether or not we are justified in our hatred, but merely assert that we are strongly emotionally thrown due to this hatred. We think about this person more often than we wish. We imagine their eyes being pecked out by crows. We dwell upon their destruction to a level of distraction that we can no longer effectively function in our daily lives. We lose sleep over this person, so it jeopardizes our job. Our friends start distancing themselves from us because we seem to talk of nothing but the object of our hate. How do we purge these emotions? One exercise that can help us rid ourselves of these emotions is to undermine the importance of the wrongs we perceive this person has done us. This is not to say we excuse or justify their wrongs, but we simply put their wrongs into perspective of the grand scheme of things. We do this by reflecting upon our impending, non-negotiable, inevitable death. We imagine our last moment alive and attempt to draw out of us what it will feel like until, well, we feel panic. From this vantage point, we then look upon the perceived wrongs of our object of hate and come to see how absolutely insignificant they are compared to what we have yet to experience. This in turn helps us to put all the wrongs done to us on a different scale. We dwell upon, well, the eternity of death and the shortness of life, and again, the significance of our troubles in the grand scheme of things disappear into oblivion. This one exercise on its own, when done numerous times, has a therapeutic effect. We find that the heat is removed from our hatred. Sure, we were wronged, but what little does it matter when compared to the reality of our own mortality? What do these slights matter in the scope of eternity and the vastness of the universe? We come to the realization that we should probably be spending, well, more time thinking about more important things, than the object of our hate. And as we learn to purge our thoughts about this person, so too our emotions calm. For those struggling with hatred and the passions in general, rest assured that philosophy not only can help, but it was originally intended for these sorts of purposes. But for now, thanks for listening. Go team.